The worst book I read this year was The Summer Tree by Gavriel K. It's a high fantasy book. K was involved somehow in the organizing of Tolkien's posthumous works. He worked on the Silmarillion or something like that. Somebody will leave me a paragraph of biographical detail about what the exact involvement was. It was derivative to an extreme degree of Middle-earth, that whole mythos. I thought it was really boilerplate high fantasy stuff. Felt like it was written for teenagers until the very end when there was a horrifying, violent, dark rape scene that is just sprung upon the reader out of nowhere. And it goes from being a daytime cartoon to an NC-17 torture porn horror fest out of nowhere. And I really didn't appreciate it. And I don't have a particularly weak stomach, but it really left a bad taste in my mouth. And I hear his later work is better. I thought it was awful. I did finish it. All of the books on this list I did finish. There were a handful of DNFs. We're not counting those. Galactic Patrol by E.E. Doc Smith. It's a important historically space opera that I don't care for. I don't have this sense of nostalgia for golden age pulp science fiction. I don't have rose-tinted lenses in terms of that kind of stuff, the teen boy wish fulfillment type fiction. I don't care. It doesn't do anything for me. It feels very cliche now. Yes, I know I'm bringing my 2022 sensibilities to classic fiction, but I can't help it. I am a 2022 reader. The genre has kind of moved on. I can appreciate it for its historical importance, but that's about all. Weeping May Tarry by L. Sprague de Camp and I think Fletcher Pratt, if I remember correctly. I don't know. There will be a thumbnail on the screen. It's a fix-up of two novellas. Religious SF, really clumsy. The first half is okay. The second half, really terrible. One of the worst kind of on-the-nose, obvious endings that I've ever read. Very skippable. Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton. Wound up even lower on the list than I thought it would be, and I anticipated it being pretty low. It's this low because of its length. It's around 1,000 pages long. I thought it was poorly written. I thought it was sluggish. I thought it was remarkably bloated. And it has one bright spot, chapter 17. The rest of it I could do without, and I simply found extremely boring and a chore to finish. And I don't intend to read Judas Unchained. This Fortress World by James Gunn. Gunn isn't really talked about anymore. He wrote a bunch of stories and novels and some histories of science fiction. This was his first novel. It was middling. It was extremely middling. I would give it a 5 out of 10. I remember that because I remember thinking at the time, wow, this is a perfect 5 out of 10. And that's a hard thing to find, the perfect 5. I remember very little about the plot. I do remember that there was a cool idea in it where, because human-settled worlds were so distant, the fuel costs of transporting warships between planetary systems was prohibitive to any kind of galactic conquest. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I found very middling. Another big classic that it just isn't. For me, I don't really think it's all that funny. There's a few inventive ideas in it. I like the improbability drive, if I remember that correctly. But I thought that the humor fell flat. And it's not because I don't like British humor, as many people have suggested to me in the comments. It's because it's just not that funny to me. Highway to Eternity by Clifford Simak, an extremely forgettable, mediocre novel about stuff. Another one that I barely remember. Certainly cannot hold a flame to City, which I think is a total stone cold classic. This is kind of just stone cold. Orphans of the Sky by Robert Heinlein probably generated the most backlash of any review that I've ever done. It's a novella about a colony ship that runs out of fuel, and a few generations later, human society has kind of come apart at the seams. Everybody lives inside this giant spaceship, and there's a cast of mutants that live in the peripheries of the ship. And there's conflict between the human population and the mutants, and they are they come into the realization that they occupy a spaceship that they came to construe as the entirety of the universe. It's a quickly paced, decently written, interesting book, and I didn't like it because I wondered out loud when I reviewed it if it might be misogynist, and I would describe people's reactions to that as reasoned, calm, reasonable. The women in the book basically do not speak, and I'm not trying to put it through some Bechdel test thing, but it's really conspicuous. There's basically no female characters. None of them say anything ever, and when they do appear, they're getting punched in the face, and it seemed when I was reading it like it was being played for yucks. And so I said in the video, this seems like this is misogynist, and people could not accept that even as a possibility. And I said in the video that I was open to being wrong. I'm still open to being wrong in that interpretation. It just seemed pretty obvious to me. If you want to wave this historical context card and say that I'm an idiot for even wondering about it, if you don't think that it's possible for a work of fiction to be actually legitimately misogynist or possessed of traits like that of misogyny or racism simply because it's old, doesn't give it a pass in that. And if that's not a question that can possibly occur to you in your brain, then your brain is made of poo-poo and pee-pee. I'm sorry. Isle of the Dead by Roger Zelazny. We're getting into the territory where I don't really consider these bad books. This was just a little bit mediocre and forgettable. It's about a guy who has a talent that he learned from an alien culture to generate entire worlds based on some kind of psychic authorship. He's able to just manifest entire planets, and he's drawn by an old enemy to one of his former creations to do battle, and it has to do a lot with gods and mythology, which is typical of Zelazny. I thought that it suffered from... There's kind of this Zelazny syndrome that I've noticed, where there's a lot of winking and nodding and almost breaking the fourth wall and interjecting contemporary turns of phrase and language, which happens naturally for any author. I think there's no way around that, but does it deliberately as kind of a communication to his reader. I don't care for it, and there was a lot of that in Isle of the Dead. Masters of Everon by Gordon R. Dickson, a totally serviceable juvenile novel about a guy who owns a psychic pet alien tiger that he has to bring home to Everon, its home world, and gets involved in a feud with space ranchers and space urbanites. And it's interesting. It's nothing groundbreaking, but definitely highly readable. Simply not anything of great literary interest. Ancient My Enemy, also by Gordon R. Dickson. It's a collection of short stories. Some of them are really good. The title story was really good. And the last one, I don't remember what it's called. It's very similar. Those were especially good. There was a lot of filler though, so highs and lows. It was overall fine. Voyager and Night by C.J. Cherryh was a book I was hoping would be space alien body horror, and was more psychological horror. It's about a group of 3 young people in their early 20s who get abducted by a massive alien craft and are left to wander the halls unattended except by apparitions that appear to them, and strange things happen. It's definitely a very slow burn, very character driven, and a little bit dull and a little bit bloated. I think it probably lived as a short story first and was then kind of beefed up into a novel. Should maybe have stayed a short story. The Player of Games by Iain M. Banks, another cherished book on BookTube. I didn't really care for it. I definitely think it was much superior to Pandora's Star. It did also, I think, suffer from bloat a little bit. I know that that's sacrilegious. I've seen in a couple places on the internet people are extremely furious at me for having this opinion about it. It just didn't do the trick for me. I thought it was okay. I thought it was okay space opera. I don't think that it was anything particularly profound or groundbreaking. And I just thought it was fine. I thought it was fine and a little bit too long. Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. Again, perfectly serviceable, fine. I can't point to anything wrong with this one. It's short. It was written as a juvenile. It was written for middle schoolers and early teens. It was written in 1968. It's a classic of high fantasy. It's fine. The Crystal World by J.G. Ballard is a extremely beautifully written, boring book. It was the first Ballard that I've read, and at some point I would like to go back to it and reread it because Ballard has his own speed. Ballard has his own language, his own feel. It's about a doctor who treats plague victims traveling to Africa, a remote part of Africa, to try to make contact again with a former love interest who disappeared into the jungle and finds that portions of the jungle are being transformed whole cloth into strange crystalline structures by some alien force. It's highly literary. It is, again, very slow, but I do appreciate it for the quality of the writing. Deus Ex by Norman Spinrad is definitely a mixed bag, but overall very good. Really good characters. It's about a priest who gets contacted by the Roman Catholic Church in a near future where the Earth has succumbed to climate apocalypse and everything is flooded and kind of run down, and a lot of people have retreated into virtual reality, and he's tapped to retrieve somebody who has died and his consciousness has passed into virtual reality, and the priest has to reckon with whether or not the AI version of this person possesses a soul. It's very reminiscent of something like James Blish. It's not as well written as James Blish. It has a few hangnails kind of irritating at the peripheries, but it is a really good book. The Time Dweller by Michael Moorcock is a collection of short stories. A lot of it is set in a dying Earth setting, to be redundant. Not quite, obviously, on par with Jack Vance, because who is, but kind of a nice little medium, comfortable set point between Vance and the Elric books, the Elric stories, go figure. Rhialto the Marvellous by Jack Vance. It's the last of the Dying Earth novels and the worst, which is not to say that it's bad. I definitely enjoyed it. The characters are a little bit less memorable. The background of the Dying Earth is definitely pretty far in the background. Doesn't have the same sense of terroir, the French word for the feeling of the taste of the soil and the food and the drink that you consume. It just was lacking. But it is very good. It's very funny. I laughed out loud a couple times. The names of the spells actually elicited an LOL out of me, which very rarely happens when I read. Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. I finally finished it. I must have attempted to finish this book a dozen times over the course of my life. I always found it a little bit dull. I found more to like this final go-around, and I finally finished it. Like I just described for Jack Vance, it does, of course, have a wonderful sense of place. It is dry, and it's slow, but I like the feeling. I like the atmosphere. I like the sense of sadness in the book that I hadn't noticed on previous reads. And at some point I would like to go do my due diligence to finish Two Towers and Return of the King, because I haven't read them, which makes everybody mad. Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. Cosmic horror, very Lovecraftian. If you've seen the movie, this is about a third of that in terms of plot. Although, obviously, a lot of similarities. I think the book is a little bit better ish. There are moments in the book that are really great. Thought it was a little bit incomplete. It was written deliberately as part one of a 3-part series, and didn't love it as much as a lot of people, but definitely didn't dislike it, definitely liked it. Swords and Deviltry by Fritz Leiber. It's a really formative work of sword and sorcery fantasy. I have confirmed, or had confirmed for me many times since posting my recent review of it. It was a big influence on Dungeons and Dragons. It feels like reading Dungeons and Dragons with a little literary spice thrown on top. I thought that they were simple but effective and were written with more literary flourish than you might expect. Nine Princes in Amber by Roger Zelazny. It's a high fantasy thriller, which is a new one to me, and read it in one sitting. Really entertaining. It's what they call a ripping yarn in the business. There were interjections of that kind of winky, naughty type writing that I don't really care for. Tono-Bungay, a literary fiction novel by H.G. Wells. Not at all one of his more famous books, but one of his favorites. He considered it his masterpiece, and I would not concur with him, but it is a great novel, if slow, very painfully slow in parts. It's written as a memoir of a fictional character going through a coming-of-age process, and working for an uncle who comes up with a quack medicine called Tono-Bungay that he brings to market and becomes fabulously wealthy. The young man has to figure out how to cope with his conscience, becoming rich, ripping people off. It's a satire of the marketing industry at the time, which is stunningly reminiscent of how marketing still works today and all of its obnoxiousness, and also detailing his love interests and emotional growth. It really is a great book, and it should be more famous than it is. The Boat of a Million Years by Paul Anderson. This was my first Paul Anderson book. I thought it was wonderfully well written. It's an alternate history that's very long. It's like 700 pages long, about a minority of humans who are immortal, and detailing their lives as they age through the ages and experience historical events firsthand, as you can imagine that they would, and finding and encountering one another, establishing relationships, and carrying forward into the future. It's much more an alternate history than a proper true science fiction. The science fiction elements don't kick in until the very end, and I was kind of waiting for them and waiting and waiting and waiting and getting a little bit frustrated. But if you go into it without understanding, it should be great. The characters are very memorable, and the historical realism was very high. You can tell that Anderson definitely did his homework. Behold the Man by Michael Moorcock is kind of a little bit similar. It's an alternate history. It's much more science fiction, heavy forward, SF forward than Boat of a Million Years. It's about a man who goes back in time to Palestine at the time of Christ and goes looking for Christ, finds John the Baptist in the desert, cannot find Jesus until he can, and strange things happen. It was a highly controversial book at the time, it turns out, and I really liked it. I liked it a lot. I definitely think that it's not my favorite Moorcock, and there is just a touch of, I would call it maybe atheist smugness in it, but it's okay. It's a great book. Marooned in Real Time is the sequel to The Peace War. Vernor Vinge, hard science fiction writer who produced A Fire Upon the Deep, which has always forever been one of my all-timer, top one or two favorite books. Can't describe it without describing The Peace War, which is next. So taken in total, as a series, it's very good. It's very solid, hard science fiction, techno thriller about private enterprise that exerts total world dominance over all world governments and militaries. They develop a technology that allows them to create what are called baubles, Bobbles, impenetrable spheres that encapsulate whatever is inside them and freezes them in time. So they bobble the whole infrastructure of every military in the world. The two books are very solid. They are a little dry. That's kind of Vernor Vinge's signature, unfortunately. The characters aren't that great, but they're packed with really cool ideas. Marooned in Real Time takes place way farther in the future, and it's a different book. It's a detective story that's not as interesting as Peace War. I wouldn't skip it necessarily, but I definitely think Peace War is better. Iain by Greg Bear is the second Bear that I read, and it's a big old space opera, big dumb object book that starts off incredibly strong. It's like reading a James Cameron movie if James Cameron was handed an infinite budget. The first half to 2/3 of the book are phenomenal, and then it takes a dip, tapers off into this totally, almost completely different plot with different characters and different sets of stakes. And there's too much exposition, and it's kind of convoluted and confusing. And all the dramatic tension just evaporates out of the story. which is kind of frustrating. I haven't read the sequels. Still worth reading for that first chunk. It's great. A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr. Highly literary science fiction. I don't venerate it in the way that a lot of people do. It's a very good book that is sophisticated in its themes. I don't share its religious outlook. I think it is a better book probably if you are a Christian, but it's not like Christian fiction. I think it's a great companion piece to Foundation. And I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I feel like those two books are in dialogue with one another. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. I read it, I think, in one sitting. A deceptively sophisticated children's story. And you read that, and you read modern YA, and you wonder. You simply wonder. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Jules Verne. Pleasantly surprised by this one. I thought that it would be dry and boring, but it was really charming and very readable. In fact, page-turning at times. The main chunk of the action that you anticipate reading is a relatively small part of it. Mostly it's a travelogue. It's a travel story about a guy and his eccentric uncle and a local guide traveling through, where was it? Iceland? I think it was Iceland. Looking for a portal into the center of the earth and then finding it and getting into adventures. I was surprised how much this book got under my skin in a good way. The Blue World by Jack Vance. It's about people that live on giant lily pads on a water planet, and they're terrorized by a big sea monster that comes in and exacts tribute from them, and there's a free-thinking, heroic individual who tries to rally all the humans to overtake the monster and free themselves from its tyranny. It's great world building. It's the weird Jack Vance writing that must be read to be appreciated. It doesn't have the same X factor as Dying Earth, but it's such a great little uppercut of a standalone, concise science fiction book. Starfish by Peter Watts. This is the first novel that he ever published. It's the first in the Rifters trilogy. I have not read the other two. Watts wrote Blind Sight, which is currently my number one favorite science fiction book ever. And it feels like Blind Sight. It's not quite up to the level of Blind Sight, but if you like Blind Sight, you should read Starfish. It's about a colony of researchers who live on the bottom of the ocean in a deep trench where all the animals are of monstrous size and the people within are monstrous as well. They're handpicked for having traumatic pasts and being damaged people. It's a great little story full of atmosphere. Nova by Samuel R. Delany is a standalone space opera that's relatively short and relatively very experimental and strange. It would be hard to describe in a nutshell. Delany takes a lot of chances and does a lot of strange things, plays with old genre tropes in space opera, interjects a lot, like the high strangeness that I like in science fiction. Was a forerunner of cyberpunk, shares a lot in common with The Matrix, also is just an oddball in terms of the writing. You just kind of have to read Delany to understand what I'm trying to convey to you. I found it just a touch academic and just a touch self-consciously literary, but I thought that it was a really unique book. The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. I actually haven't reviewed this on the channel yet. I just finished it. It's the most recent book that I finished. I went from being kind of rolling my eyes reading the first 2/3 of it, wondering, like, mentally consigning it to this category of overhyped book, and then the final third of it completely won me over. I thought it was really solid, and you can tell that there's kind of maybe some amphetamine mania going on behind the scenes writing the book, but he pulls it through in the clutch at the end, and all the stuff that was incoherent feeling when I was reading it did thematically kind of synergize into one statement or one coherent seeming kind of thematic thrust, and I was really won over. I liked it a lot. I wouldn't consider it in my top 15, certainly, but it did make me want to read more Dick. The Best of C.M. Kornbluth is a collection of short stories that was curated by Frederick Pohl, who was his friend and often collaborator and sometimes adversary. It turns out, he talked about his relationship that was a little bit troubled with Kornbluth in the intro. Kornbluth was a Golden Age author who did not get enough credit because he died early, and he never had a book that became like a big famous work. His most famous work is The Space Merchants, which I haven't read. The short fiction is really remarkable. It's extremely modern in its tone and in his, I guess you could say, moral attitude. Very cynical, really dark, a lot of black humor. There's a couple of stories in here that are true masterpieces. There's a little bit of filler. There's kind of something for everybody. There's political works. There's a short story that's actually very similar to Man in the High Castle. It's an alternate history to do with the Nazis winning World War II. There's even body horror and cosmic horror, kind of Lovecraftian stuff. There's all kinds of craziness in there. It's really good. Maybe it should be higher on the list now that I'm talking about it. The Genocides by Thomas M. Dish is a really dark work. I talked about this on Plagued by Visions channel. He interviewed me. You should watch that video if you haven't. It's the most disturbing science fiction book that I've read. It's about Earth being colonized by aliens who seed these giant plants that are like huge trees, and there's little pockets of humanity that are holding on for dear life. And there's this one colony where all the action of the book takes place that is a religious fundamentalist community, and horrible things happen. It was written in the late 60s, but it doesn't feel like it. It's one of those ageless works and utterly bleak. The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I just talked about this book. It's a loose collection of short stories about man's conquest of Mars. It's satirical, it's dark, it's beautiful, it's beautifully written. It's also one of those required reading books, and a lot of those are a little bit overhyped. This one isn't. I was really happy to find that this, I think, deserves its fame. The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. This is my favorite high fantasy book, I think, by a pretty long shot, and it was written in the 20s. Was really influential on a lot of writers, including Tolkien. I think that it's way superior to anything that I have read by Tolkien, including The Hobbit, which is my favorite Tolkien, which I do really love. I think King of Elfland's Daughter is a truly gorgeous work of literature that feels almost like a prose poem. There are passages of it that are absolutely breathtaking. Cudgel's Saga. I've had my knuckles wrapped that it's pronounced Cugel. I don't know. We'll compromise on Cugel. How about that? It's the second of the Cugel books after The Eyes of the Overworld. It's not as good as that. It's book 3 in the Dying Earth series, but it's still wonderful. It's following... I'm going back to Cudgel. It follows Cudgel on further adventures, and it follows that same structure as Eyes of the Overworld, if you've read it, of the episodic stories. I mean, it was fixed up. It was serialized short stories. It's called a picaresque novel. There's a subgenre of scallywag fiction about misfits and ne'er-do-wells going on adventures. It's not quite as funny, it's not quite as beautiful, and it's not quite as profound, but it has touches of all those things. And if you like Eyes of the Overworld, you'll like this also. Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner. A very long and very experimental book that I think is most remarkable for its prescience. It's a book about overpopulation, and a lot of that didn't wind up happening, but it does predict the onset of mass shootings and the surveillance state and the rise of AI. There are these big picture predictions and then these little details of world building work that I didn't even realize at the time of reading it were prescient, because I didn't notice that they were fictional flourishes at the time, because they're so much a part of the world now that I just took them for granted. The Dream Master by Roger Zelazny. By far my favorite. Zelazny is the first that I read. It's about a therapist who has shared lucid dreams with his patients as part of therapy. And he is contacted by a woman who wants to learn the trade. The writing in this is some of the best writing of any science fiction book that I've ever read. It's some of the best writing of any book I've ever read. There's one paragraph in particular early on describing a car crash that I think is probably the single best written paragraph I've ever read in fiction. Past Master by R.A. Lafferty is a zany ass, off the wall acid trip of a book written by a right-wing Roman Catholic who lived in Oklahoma about the dangers of left-wing thinking. And it's a book that I carry essentially no philosophical truck with, but am in love with because it's simply so utterly bizarre. The Iron Dream by Norman Spinrad is a book about an Adolf Hitler who, instead of rising to power as the Fuhrer, immigrates in the 30s to the United States to work as an illustrator and hack writer in science fiction. And Hitler writes a novel called The Lord of the Swastika, in which he projects himself into a future that is a kind of science fantasy retelling of the actual events of World War II, in which he is the savior figure. And it's a satire of fascism. It's a satire of sword and sorcery fantasy and right-wing science fiction. And the majority of the book is reading this fake novel written by a fictional Hitler that Spinrad wrote in a deliberately hack mode. And it's simply genius. I lumped all three of the original Foundation books into one entry. I would say Second Foundation is probably my favorite. Foundation, the original book, is the best book, though. And Second Foundation is the worst. Second Foundation I thought was a little bit dull, not nearly as interesting as the first two. First Foundation is definitely the book of ideas, and the one that most people read. Second Foundation is more action-y and more readable, and more coherent than the first one, where it's a series of vignettes of different characters leapfrogging forward through time. We all know the premise of Foundation. I'm not going to reiterate it to you. Another one that I thought was going to be dull and absolutely was not. It's a really wonderful synthesis of big ideas about history and technology, and also readable action. The Palace of Eternity by Bob Shaw is a little gobstopper of a book. It's about a mechanic on a planet that was founded as an artist's colony and is under siege in the middle of a war with an alien species that is bent on the total destruction of mankind. And that is merely the tip of the iceberg. In a very short page count, it takes you places that you would never, ever see coming. It's a roller coaster of a book. I know that that's cliched to say, but you just find yourself being upside down unexpectedly again and again and again, to the point where I actually, again, literally was laughing out loud as I was reading it, as these big reveals would happen that just knocked the wind out of me, just came out of nowhere. It is a hell of a great time to read, and Shaw could write characters. This is the only Shaw book that I've read. But even the bit minor characters are written with such clear motivations and feel like real people. It's such a wonderful book. Downward to the Earth by Robert Silverberg is tied, I would say, with The World Inside for favorite Silverberg. It's certainly better known than that one. It's about a guy who goes back to a world that was administered by an imperialist government, and attempts to assuage his conscience at having been a bit of a tyrant. And there are sentient elephant aliens and sentient kind of baboon aliens. It's about redemption and ethics. Silverberg wrote books, a lot of them, that even though you could probably bang them out in one sitting, are rich with all the qualities that we like in books. High Rise by J.G. Ballard is about a condominium that descends into anarchy over the course of a few months. It's a satire of trickle-down economics and the intrusion of technology into our lives, the role of the media in our lives, the rising yuppie class, at the time that has stuck with us since. Wonderful piece of not even black comedy. There's nothing comedic about it. It's simply black. It's just a black hole. It's the kind of book that just lingers with you for a long time. I still think about it. And I read it, probably it's been 3 or 4 months. I still think about it often. A Case of Conscience by James Blish. This is one of his more famous books. It's a fix-up of 2 novellas. Has one of the best endings of any book ever. Hard to describe, and I can't describe it without giving really important things away. It's a novel that grapples with a religious concept, and that shouldn't scare you off if you're not a religious person. Nobody could write like Blish. Nobody wrote with the erudition of a Blish, that I've read at least. There are parts where he is potentially too erudite. There's a section where he works through a logic problem at the heart of part of Finnegan's Wake by Joyce, and it's definitely a beach read. Norstrilia by Cordwainer Smith, a book I'm not even going to bother to try to summarize because it would take an hour. It's kind of like Past Master in that it's simply just batshit off the wall weird. It was really influential on a bunch of space opera that followed it. And if you like Dune, if you want like a weird ass psychedelic version of Dune written by C.S. Lewis, you might like Norstrilia. I love Norstrilia. Hothouse by Brian Aldiss is one of the best pieces of world building I have ever read. Millions of years in the future, the Earth ceases to rotate and the side that faces the sun becomes overwhelmed by a giant banyan forest where the principal characters live. Humanity has devolved into a very primitive form and are constantly under mortal threat from all the creatures that they cohabitate the planet with. Some of the best creatures of any science fiction book that I've read. The stakes are insane. People die constantly, which is fun. And it never stops one-upping itself. It's not like a literarily profound book, although the ending is great. It does hit its stride right at the end, but it just gets crazier and crazier and cooler as it goes along. You probably won't be able to stop reading it. People complain about the tummy belly men. They didn't really bother me, but they infuriate a lot of readers, so I guess beware. Black Easter by James Blish. Even though Case of Conscience is a much more celebrated and famous book, I actually prefer Black Easter. I did just read it, so maybe that's a little bit of recency bias. It's about a guy in the U.S. military who contacts a black magician to summon demons to do dastardly things in the world. It's a satire, very, very, very dark satire of militarism and nationalism. It's a distinct Cold War parable, but also it kicks so much ass. It's so great, and it is hard to find. If you can find it, snatch it up and read it. He wrote it based on actual occult texts. He meant it to be a realistic book about black magic, how black magic would work if black magic were actually real in the way that it was described historically. It's great. Blood Music by Greg Bear is another one that you just have to read. It goes from really small stakes, techno thriller, to universe-spanning meditation on the nature of consciousness and quantum mechanics. It's incredible. It's often pitched as a science fiction horror. It has horror elements. There's a lot of ooey gooey body horror in it, but that's not the point. It is not a horror book. It is a book with horror in it. If any of that appeals to you, just grab it and read it. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. If my arm were twisted to the point of breaking and I had to name the best fantasy book that I've read, I would probably have to give it to this one, even though there are books that are more fun that I would rather reread. It's about Satan visiting Moscow in the 1930s and wreaking havoc in the cultural scene and in the personal lives of kind of bureaucrats and government functionaries. And also there's a parallel story that's an alternate retelling of the story of Pontius Pilate and Jesus. In parts, it's not terribly resonant and a little bit hard to penetrate as a Western reader in 2022. But get through the middle section, which might be a little bit boring to the end. It is just stunningly beautiful and profound. It was a criticism primarily of atheism, also of the communist order of the time. Bulgakov wrote it at risk of his life, and it wasn't published until the 60s. Incredibly courageous act of him to write it, and is rightly remembered as one of the best pieces of literature ever produced in world history. The Eyes of the Overworld by Jack Vance is my favorite fantasy book. Even though having said all that about Master and Margarita, it's the one that I would be most enthusiastic to reread. I still think the Dying Earth book, the first one, is preferable to me. That's the one that I really have the love affair with. But Eyes of the Overworld, which is much more fantasy than science fiction or science fantasy, just read it. It has amazing world building. It's a great adventure story. Cudgel is a great protagonist character, an anti-hero, and it's also one of the funniest books that I've ever read. If you like P.G. Wodehouse, you will like Vance generally, but especially this one. Neuromancer by William Gibson. We've all probably read it. If you haven't, you should read it. I hadn't until this year, as you might have been able to infer. And I had somewhat muted expectations. I read it out of a sense of, I just had this itch of like, it's dumb that I haven't read it, so I'll get it out of the way. And my God, that it surpassed my expectations. Has to be the strongest prose of any science fiction book I've ever read. If you only pick it up and read the first act, was it Sheba City Blues? Even if you don't care for cyberpunk, even if you find the plot convoluted and not fun to read, if you simply look at it as a museum piece of, look at this incredibly beautiful thing that somebody created with language, just do that. Roadside Picnic by Boris and Arkady Strugatsky. This could have been my number one. I consider it a perfect 10. I consider it a perfect book. It's about aliens that come to Earth, touch down, and leave in their wake these areas where physics behaves strangely, that are extremely dangerous and are also full of valuable alien artifacts that are burgled by a cast of thief called Stalkers. It's a brutal and uncompromising, but at times highly sentimental book. Purely as a literary construction, I think that it is perfect. I also deeply identify with its antagonisms. I was also deeply moved by it. I think that the main character is one of the best protagonists I have ever read. The best book that I read all year was Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. It kind of had to be this one. I read whatever the most recent translation was, the one that you can get on Kindle. Another perfect book. Genre-defying piece of science fiction that is philosophical with a capital P. At the time of reading it, it kind of washed over me. I read it really quickly. And even having read it really quickly, there was this delayed onset thing that happened where I kept returning to it and thinking about it. And it has just grown and grown in my memory and in the kind of floor space that it occupies in my thinking about genre fiction. It's possibly the high watermark of literary science fiction that I've encountered, even though there's one or two other books that maybe I just like more. This one, I think, is literary science fiction distilled to its purest, most potent form. Thanks for watching. Happy holidays, and I hope you got a few ideas of books to pick up and read. We'll see if I can top this number in the coming year.